I wired her $250,000. She sent me photos, updates, invoices, permits. I believed every single word, until I flew to Cebu and there was nothing. No restaurant, no registration, no trace. Just an empty lot and a woman I didn't recognize anymore. I was sitting across from Marietta at this tiny beachside place in Mactan, watching her laugh as she tried to teach me how to crack crab claws without making a mess. I'd been in Cebu for 3 months by then, and I still couldn't get it right. She had this way of laughing that made you feel like you were in on the joke, not the butt of it. "Kenneth, you're making it harder than it is," she said, reaching over to guide my hands. "You don't force it, you find the weak spot, like this." The shell cracked perfectly in her fingers. I looked at her and thought, this woman knows what she's doing. The divorce back in Perth had left me feeling like a discarded appliance. 32 years of marriage, and my ex-wife told me I was boring, that I'd stop trying, that she needed more. So I left. Sold the house, split everything down the middle, and booked a one-way ticket to the Philippines because a mate at the pub said it was cheap and warm and no one would bother me. I wasn't looking for anything. I just wanted to stop feeling like a failure. Marietta worked in the resort kitchen where I was staying, not out front serving drinks to tourists. In the back, prepping food, managing inventory, keeping things running. She was 45, a widow, raising 2 teenage sons on her own. She didn't flirt like some of the younger women around the resort. She didn't giggle or touch my arm or ask me to buy her things. She just talked to me like I was a person. We started having breakfast together most mornings. She'd finish her shift and sit with me while I drank coffee and watched the waves. "You seem sad," she said one morning, not looking at me, just peeling a mango with a small knife. "I'm not sad," I said. "I'm just tired." "Tired is sad in a different language," she replied. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. She told me about her husband, how he died in a motorcycle accident 5 years ago, how she'd been working 2 jobs ever since to keep her boys in school. "They're smart," she said. "Smarter than me. I want them to have more than I had." "What did you have?" I asked. She smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Rice and hope. That's about it." I liked that she didn't pretend her life was easy. She didn't try to be anything she wasn't. That afternoon we walked along the beach, and she told me about growing up in a village outside Cebu, how she'd started cooking when she was 6 years old, helping her mother prepare meals for 12 people every night. "Food was love in our house," she said. "If you cooked for someone, it meant you cared." "Do you still feel that way?" I asked. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and said, "Yes, I do." We stopped at a small eatery near the water, and she ordered for both of us. Kinila, lechon kawali, sinagla. She explained every dish, told me how it was made, why it mattered. I realized I hadn't cared about food in years. My ex-wife used to microwave frozen meals and call it dinner, but Marietta talked about cooking like it was art, like it was life. "If I ever open my own place," she said quietly, almost like she was talking to herself, "I'd want it to feel like this, like home." I looked at her, at the way her eyes softened when she talked about it, and I thought, maybe I could help her do that. Maybe that's what I came here for. I extended my stay another month, then another. Marietta and I started spending more time together. Not dating, exactly, just being around each other. She'd invite me to her place sometimes, a small concrete house she rented near the port. Her sons were polite, shy, always doing homework at the kitchen table. "This is Kenneth," she told them the first time I visited. "He's my friend from Australia." They nodded and went back to their books. I liked that she didn't make it a big deal. One evening we were sitting outside her house, drinking San Miguel and watching the neighborhood kids play basketball in the street. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "I've been working in kitchens since I was 16, Kenneth. 29 years. I've made other people rich, and I'm still living paycheck to paycheck. That's not fair," I said. She shrugged. Fare doesn't feed my kids. What would you do if you could do anything? I asked. She looked at me like I'd asked her to solve a math problem. I'd open a restaurant. A small one. Nothing fancy. Just real Filipino food. The kind people grow up eating and miss when they move away. What's stopping you? She laughed, but there was no joy in it. Money, permits, time, fear, take your pick. What if you had the money? I asked. She shook her head. It's just a dream, Kenneth. Dreams don't pay bills. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night I went back to my hotel and started researching restaurant costs in Cebu. Lease prices, equipment, permits, staffing. It wasn't as expensive as I thought, not compared to Australia. $250,000 could set up something real, something sustainable. And I had that money. I had more than that, sitting in accounts back home, doing nothing. I thought about my ex-wife telling me I'd stop trying. I thought about Marietta's face when she talked about her dream. I thought about how good it felt to matter to someone again. The next time I saw her, I said, what if it didn't have to stay a dream? What if we made it real? She stared at me for a long moment, and then she said, Kenneth, I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, I said. I'm offering. She didn't say anything. She just looked down at her hands, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. Why would you do that? She whispered. Because I want to, I said. Because you deserve it. Because I have the money, and no reason not to. She wiped her eyes and smiled at me. Not the sad smile, a real one. You're a good man, Kenneth. Better than you think you are. I didn't feel good. I felt useful. And that was enough. 2 weeks later, Marietta came to my hotel with a folder. Inside was a handwritten business plan. 12 pages, front and back. Lease costs, equipment lists, permit fees, staff wages, initial inventory, projected revenue. She'd even drawn a rough floor plan. I couldn't sleep, she said, handing it to me. I kept thinking about what you said, so I wrote it all down. I wanted to show you I'm serious. This wasn't some vague idea. This was a real plan. You did all this yourself? I asked. She nodded. I've been thinking about it for years. I just never thought it could actually happen. She sat down across from me and laid out the details. She'd found a location. A small commercial space near the Mactan port. High foot traffic from tourists and locals. Affordable rent. The landlord was willing to negotiate. It's not big, she said. Maybe 40 seats. But it's enough. How much would it cost to get started? I asked. She pulled out a calculator and showed me the numbers. Lease deposit and 6 months' rent. Kitchen equipment. Tables, chairs, plates, utensils. Business registration and permits. Staff salaries for the first 3 months. Initial food inventory. It came to $250,000. That's everything? I asked. Everything to open and run for 6 months, she said. After that, it should be self-sustaining. If it works, what happens? She looked at me carefully. I was thinking, if you invest the money, I'll run it full time. I'll handle everything, the cooking, the staff, the operations, and we split the profits, 60% for you, 40% for me. Does that sound fair? I didn't even think about it. I said yes. She blinked. Kenneth, you should take time to think about this. It's a lot of money. I don't need time, I said. I trust you. She reached across the table and took my hand. You've changed my life, Kenneth. You know that? I felt like a king, like I'd finally done something that mattered. We shook hands, and she cried a little, and I felt more alive than I had in years. The next morning I went to the bank and wired her $100,000 for the lease and initial setup. She sent me a photo of the receipt an hour later with a message that said, "This is real. We're really doing this," I replied. Yes, we are. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of the end. I flew back to Australia 2 weeks later to sort out my affairs. I was planning to move to Cebu permanently once the restaurant was up and running. I needed to close accounts, sell some things, figure out my visa situation. Marietta and I stayed in constant contact. She sent me updates every few days, photos of the lease signing, a blurry picture of her standing in front of the empty space, invoices for kitchen equipment written in Tagalog, screenshots of permit applications with government stamps. She said the registration process was slow, that the city office was backed up, that everything in the Philippines took twice as long as it should. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? A month in, she messaged me saying they needed to start renovations. The space needed new flooring, fresh paint, electrical work. She sent me an estimate from a contractor, $80,000. I wired it the same day. 2 weeks after that, she said the equipment supplier needed payment up front. Stoves, refrigerators, prep tables, a commercial dishwasher, $50,000. I wired it. She sent me photos of delivery trucks, of boxes stacked in the space. The images were always a little blurry, a little dark, but I told myself that's just how phone cameras were in the Philippines. My daughter Claire called me one night. "Dad, are you sure about this?" she asked. "Sure about what?" I said, even though I knew what she meant. "This woman, this restaurant, you barely know her." "I know her well enough," I said. "She's not like that, Claire. She's honest. She's hardworking. She's real." "Dad, you sent her how much?" "That's none of your business," I said, and I heard how defensive I sounded. "It is my business when you're about to lose everything," she said. "I'm not losing anything," I snapped. "I'm investing. There's a difference." She went quiet for a moment, then said, "Just be careful, okay? Please." "I'm being careful," I said, but I wasn't. I'd convinced myself this was the right thing, the smart thing, the thing that proved I wasn't the boring, used-up man my ex-wife said I was. Every time I sent money, I felt powerful. Every time Marietta thanked me, I felt needed. That was worth more than the money. A few weeks before I was supposed to fly back for the soft opening, Marietta sent me another photo. She said it was the restaurant sign being installed. I zoomed in as far as I could, but the image was too dark. I could barely make out the shape of a building. "Looks great," I texted back. "Can't wait to see it in person." "Me too," she replied. "You're going to be so proud." I stared at that message for a long time. I wanted to be proud. I needed to be. So I chose to believe everything was fine. I booked my flight back to Cebu for the soft opening. Marietta seemed excited when I told her, but also vague about the exact date. "We're still waiting on one more permit," she said. "The health inspection. It should be any day now." "That's fine," I said. "I'll be there in 2 weeks." That's plenty of time. When I landed in Cebu, Marietta picked me up from the airport. She looked different, tired. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Kenneth," she said, hugging me briefly. "It's good to see you." "It's good to see you too," I said. "I can't wait to see the place." She didn't say anything. We got in her car, and she drove in silence for a while. Finally, I asked, "Is everything okay?" "There's been a delay," she said, "with the permit. The inspector is being difficult, asking for things we already provided." "How long of a delay?" I asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. My stomach tightened. "So the opening is postponed?" "Just until we get the permit," she said quickly. "Everything else is ready. The kitchen, the staff, the menu. We're just waiting on paperwork." I nodded, trying to push down the unease. "Can we still visit the place?" "I'd love to see it," she hesitated. "It's not really ready for visitors yet. It's a mess, construction dust everywhere." "I don't mind," I said. "I just want to see it." She gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Kenneth, maybe we should wait until it's finished. I want you to see it when it's perfect." "Marietta," I said, and my voice was firmer than I intended. I've sent you $230,000. I'd like to see where it went. She looked at me, and for a second, I saw something in her face. Fear, maybe, or anger. Then she sighed. Okay, we can go. We drove to the address she'd given me months ago. A street near the port, commercial buildings, small shops, a few restaurants. When we pulled up, I looked around, confused. In front of us was an empty lot. Dirt, weeds, a faded "For Lease" sign, half buried in the grass. I stared at it, my heart starting to pound. "Where is it?" I asked. Marietta didn't look at me. She lit a cigarette and stared straight ahead. "This isn't the place, Kenneth." "What do you mean this isn't the place?" I said. "This is the address you gave me." "We moved locations last month," she said, her voice flat. "I told you that. Don't you remember?" "You never told me that." "I would remember if you told me that." She finally looked at me, and her eyes were cold. "I sent you a message. You must not have read it." "Marietta, I read every message you send me," I said, and my voice was shaking now. "Where is the restaurant?" She took a long drag of her cigarette. "The new location. I'll take you there tomorrow. I'm tired right now." "Take me there now," I said. "Kenneth, I said I'm tired. Take me there now," I repeated, and I wasn't asking anymore. She started the car and drove without saying another word. My hands were shaking. I stared out the window, trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. We drove for 20 minutes. She pulled up in front of a closed hardware store. The windows were boarded up. "This is it?" I asked. She didn't answer. I got out of the car and walked up to the door. There was a sign that said "For Lease" with a phone number. The place had clearly been closed for months, maybe years. I turned around. Marietta was still in the car, smoking, staring at nothing. I got back in. "Marietta," I said quietly, "what is going on?" "Nothing is going on," she said. "This is the new place. We're still negotiating with the landlord." "This place is closed," I said. "It's been closed for a long time." "It's in transition," she snapped. "Why are you interrogating me? Don't you trust me?" I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. She drove me back to my hotel in silence. When we pulled up, she finally spoke. "You should have trusted me, Kenneth. I told you everything takes longer here. I do trust you," I said, but even I could hear the doubt in my voice. She drove away without another word. I stood there in front of the hotel, feeling like I was going to be sick. The next morning I woke up early and took a taxi to the Cebu Business Permits and Licensing Office. I didn't tell Marietta where I was going. I walked up to the counter and told the clerk I was looking for a business registration under the name Marietta Santos. The clerk typed into her computer, waited, then shook her head. "No registration under that name, sir." "Can you check again?" I asked. "Maybe it's under a business name? A restaurant?" She checked again. "Nothing, sir. No permits issued. No business entity registered." I felt my chest tighten. "Are you sure?" "Yes, sir. If it was registered, it would be in the system." I thanked her and walked out. I stood on the street, people moving around me, cars honking, the sun beating down, and I felt completely alone. I pulled out my phone and called a number a friend had given me before I left Australia, a local paralegal who helped expats with legal issues. His name was Benji. "Hello, this is Benji," he answered. "Hi, my name is Kenneth. I need help verifying some business documents." "Of course, sir. What kind of documents?" I explained everything: the restaurant, the money, the permits, the addresses. He listened quietly, and when I finished, he said, "Sir, can you come to my office? I'd like to look into this properly." I met him an hour later. He took down all the information, the addresses, the amounts, Marietta's full name. He made some calls while I sat there, my stomach in knots. After about 30 minutes, he hung up and looked at me. Sir, there is no business registered under her name, no permits, no lease agreements on file for either address you mentioned. I spoke to the landlord of the first property. He says no one has inquired about that space in over a year. I stared at him. What about the second place, the hardware store? Closed 3 years ago, he said. The owner moved to Manila. It's been empty since. I couldn't speak. I just sat there, trying to process what he was telling me. Sir, Benji said gently, I'm very sorry, but I see this often. You are not the first. Not the first what? I asked. Even though I knew, not the first foreigner to be deceived this way. The restaurant story is common. Also the sick relative, the emergency surgery, the family land that needs to be saved. It's always something that sounds noble. I shook my head. She wouldn't do that. She's not like that. He looked at me with something like pity. Sir, I understand, but the evidence says otherwise. I left his office and walked back to my hotel. I texted Marietta. We need to talk. She didn't respond. I tried calling. It rang once, then went to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. I sent another message. Marietta, please. Just talk to me. 6 hours later, she finally replied, Why are you investigating me? Don't you trust me? I stared at that message, and something inside me broke. I typed back, Where's the restaurant, Marietta? Where did the money go? She didn't respond. I sat in my hotel room that night, staring at my phone, replaying every conversation we'd ever had, every smile, every hug, every thank you, every promise. And for the first time, I let myself think the thing I'd been avoiding for months. There never was a restaurant. There was never going to be a restaurant. She took my money, and I gave it to her. Willingly, eagerly, desperately, because I wanted to believe I mattered. The next day I went to her house. I didn't call first. I just showed up. When I knocked, a man answered. He was younger, maybe mid-30s, shirtless, holding a beer. Yeah? He said. I'm looking for Marietta, I said. He turned and yelled into the house. Marietta, some old guy is here for you. She appeared a moment later, and when she saw me, her face hardened. Kenneth, what are you doing here? I need to talk to you, I said. The man looked between us. Who is this? A friend, Marietta said quickly. My cousin. He's my cousin. I looked at the man. He didn't look like her cousin. He looked at me like I was a joke. Can we talk privately? I asked. She sighed, annoyed. Fine. Come in. We sat at her kitchen table. The man stayed on the porch, smoking, watching us through the window. I spoke calmly. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just laid it out. I went to the permits office. There's no registration under your name. I checked both addresses. Neither location has been leased. I hired someone to verify everything. Marietta, there's no restaurant. She stared at me, her face blank. So? She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. Where do you think it went, Kenneth? I don't know, I said. That's why I'm asking. She laughed, but it was a cruel sound. It went to my son's school fees, to fixing this house, to my mother's hospital bills, to paying off the debts my husband left me. It went to keeping my family alive. I felt like I couldn't breathe. You lied to me. I told you what you wanted to hear, she said. You wanted to be a hero. You wanted to feel important. I gave you that. But the restaurant, I said weakly. There was no restaurant, Kenneth, she said, and her voice was so cold. There was never going to be a restaurant. I needed money. You had money. That's all this was. Was any of it real? I asked, and I hated how my voice cracked. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she shrugged. Does it matter? The man on the porch laughed. I stood up. My legs felt like they might give out. I trusted you, I said. That's your problem, not mine, she replied. I walked out of that house and got into a taxi. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just sat there, staring out the window as we drove back to the hotel. It wasn't until I was alone in my room, sitting on the edge of the bed, that I let myself break. I cried for the first time in years. Not because of the money, because I'd been so desperate to matter that I'd let myself be used, and I had no one to blame but myself. I flew back to Australia 3 days later. I didn't try to see Marietta again. I didn't go to the police. What would I even say? I willingly sent money to someone without a contract, without verification, without anything in writing. My lawyer confirmed what I already knew. Without documentation, without a registered business entity, there's no legal recourse, he said. You could try to pursue civil action, but the cost would likely exceed any potential recovery, and the Philippine legal system is slow. It could take years. So, I just lose the money, I said. I'm afraid so, he said. I'm very sorry, Kenneth. I told my daughter what happened. We met for coffee, and I laid it all out. The whole stupid, humiliating story. When I finished, she didn't say I told you so. She just reached across the table and held my hand. I'm sorry, Dad, she said. I'm sorry you went through that. I was an idiot, I said. You were lonely, she said. There's a difference. I started seeing a therapist a few weeks later. Not because I wanted to, but because Claire insisted. At first I hated it. Sitting in that office, talking about my feelings like some kind of broken thing. But slowly, over weeks and months, I started to understand. I wasn't just talking about Marietta. I was talking about my marriage. About my ex-wife telling me I wasn't enough. About feeling invisible. About desperately needing to be needed. You went to the Philippines looking for validation, my therapist said. You wanted someone to see you as valuable. And Marietta gave you that. For a price. I should have known better, I said. Maybe, she said. But you're human. And humans make mistakes when they're hurting. I started to rebuild. Slowly. I reconnected with old friends. I joined a sailing club. I started cooking again, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I thought about Marietta less and less. The anger faded. The shame took longer, but eventually, that faded too. What I was left with was something quieter, a kind of sadness, not for her, for myself, for the man I'd been, the man who was so afraid of being worthless that he'd pay $250,000 to feel important. 6 months after I got back, I was sitting on my balcony in Perth watching the sunset. I thought about the restaurant that never existed, the woman who was never who I thought she was, the man I used to be. I wasn't that man anymore. I didn't know who I was now. But for the first time in a long time, I was okay with not knowing. I gave too much. I believed too easily. I wanted too badly, but I'm still here, and maybe that's enough.